So this is just going to be a bare bones gear guide. I'm going to play an old montage in the background while I explain my gear choices with some helpful screenshots. Nothing too flashy. I get a lot of questions on why I run specific perks, etc., and I find myself often repeating things to people, so I thought I'd just make this. Also, just FYI, this is not a war build. You swap out a lot of accessories and some armor pieces to turn this into a war build, so it is pretty modular in that sense. And lastly, as a side note, you're going to find that a lot of people are very opinionated on what's BIS and what isn't. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's especially a lot of people on copium because they spent hundreds of thousands of gold on some power pieces thinking they were BIS, and then try to defend their purchases. Luckily, I'm rich, so I don't have that bias. I've tried many different builds and pieces, as you can see, and hopefully the gameplay speaks for itself too. The stats are 310 dex and 200 con. This ain't like other MMOs where you can go glass cannon and be successful. The closest thing to that is musket, solely based off their secondary int scaling, which we don't have. You gain almost no damage going above 300 dex, so you're better off running 200 con. Without 200 con, you're just going to be the stereotypical bow player that runs away after getting hit once and losing half their HP. So moving on to the bulk of the guide on my perks and the reasoning behind them. We'll start off with my armor. I run a 4 Resil, 5 Refreshing Evasion, and 3 Freedom build. And then I have 2 skill perk slots, along with Shirking Energy on my pants. Starting off with the elephant in the room, yes, Refreshing Evasion is still better than Refreshing for bow builds. For pretty much any other build like mages or bruisers, it's just not worth running. So that's why you often hear that Refreshing is better. The way I came to this is I took the average of all my skill cooldowns for bow. So 15 plus 18 plus 22 divided by 3. As long as you dodge more than 4 times within 18 seconds with your bow out, Refreshing Evasion is equal to or better than Refreshing. There are times I dodge like 8 times within 18 seconds if you look at some of my videos. Assuming 5 Refreshing Evasion versus 5 Refreshing, that's a 30% cooldown reduction versus 15%. It's not even a competition. And yes, Refreshing does reduce the cooldown of your secondary weapon while Refreshing Evasion doesn't. But you don't really care about Spear cooldown reduction anyway. Spear itself has more built-in cooldown reduction than you could ever need. So obviously the 4 Resil is mandatory. You don't really need 5 if you're going above 150 con light armor, but I'm not going to get too into that. 4 just makes your build easier and more well-rounded in general. Tricking energy on your pants is obviously mandatory as well. And then your 2 skill perks. Both are game-changing and both are mandatory. Ideally you would want Refreshing Evasion on every single piece, but that's not going to be possible if you're only wearing purple gear. So you're probably going to end up with 3 or 4 Refreshing Evasion, which is fine. You'll slowly work your way up. And then we reach what I call last priority perks. These are Freedom and Shirking Fortification. You pick one and choose to stack it 2 or 3 times for your leftover perk slots. I personally prefer Freedom, but Shirking Fort is really good too. Freedom is more useful for arenas and 1vx. Shirking Fort is more useful for 1v1s and OPR. So you can almost see what I'm getting at here. If you're a new player, you would ignore any last priority green pieces and try to get 2 perk red and yellow pieces only. With that, you have a purple set that is as close to BIS as possible without sacrificing too much. Then you have a solid foundation to slowly get to BIS. Now let's say you're playing a different build than me that requires 3 or even 4 skill perks, then you would just replace these last priority green perks with those skill perks. Also, I must mention this armor weight spreadsheet that you should definitely use. You don't have to go for the traditional medium chest build. Anything that has a total score of green is equal to my build. Anything that's yellow has slightly less defense, but is generally way cheaper and still worth running. I recently even got my friend full BIS armors for under 300k doing one of these yellow builds. It was definitely worth it. Moving on to accessories, we'll start with the amulet first. Health and stamina recovery mandatory, no argument here. For third perk, I personally love Divine and would never drop it, but you can use Champion's Amulet instead, which has Striking and Power and is free. I will mention though, the Divine is better or pretty much mandatory for arenas because of the built-in healing reduction over time. Anyone that doesn't have Divine is at a big disadvantage during the last few seconds of an arena match when the fire is closing in on everyone. Next up is Ring. Invigorated Punishment is mandatory in my opinion. Some people get Mortal Empowerment instead, but that's only for wars and OPR. Even then, you waste too much damage because of the 50% Empower cap. I still prefer Invigorated Punishment as it's basically a permanent damage increase. Keen Awareness is mandatory if your bow has Vicious, which it should. I'll get into Vicious versus Enchanted later. Also, it's very important as a base boost to your crit chance. The way crits work in this game is that your crit rate is doubled for every non-crit you do. So if you have 20% base crit chance and you don't crit, your next shot has a 40% chance to crit. And lastly, we have Hardy, which again I consider mandatory. I'll get into that in a second once I'm done with earrings. Refreshing Toast and Healthy Toast mandatory, no discussion here. 20-second health pot cooldown and a 10-second mana pot cooldown. Works even better with Divine. Anyone that doesn't have this is at a huge disadvantage against people that do. And now let's get into the Nimble and Hardy discussion. You're gonna have so many people tell you that Hardy is useless for decks because we don't get an extra dodge out of it. That's some 20 IQ shit. It's still 10 extra stamina. Combine that with Nimble and you have the fastest stamina regeneration rate in the game. That's 0.608 stamina per frame versus 0.552. That doesn't sound like a lot, but this is per frame we're talking about. The span of an entire fight, we're talking at least 100 to 200 total stamina difference in gain. Weapons are pretty simple. For my build and combo that I constantly do, the best spear will be Sundering Javelin, Attunement, and Keenly Empowered. Keenly Empowered is mandatory on any secondary weapon you use because it transfers with you on weapon swap. So let's say I crit on my spear and then switch to bow. Now I have that Keenly Empowered on my bow till it expires. And that finally takes us to bow. Attunement and Jagged is 100% mandatory. Attunement because it's simple an 18% permanent damage increase, and it works on skills and left clicks, unlike Chain. If you're crafting your own bow, make sure you force Attunement as it can't roll naturally. The best attunements are Nature, Void, and Frost. Keenly Jagged is good because you do 10% more damage to bleeding targets from our bow skill tree. Jagged has an uptime of 6 seconds with a 7-second cooldown, so it's pretty much permanently on your opponent as long as you keep hitting your shots. It also says it's supposed to do 7% damage per second, when it actually does more like 10 to 13% weapon damage per second. No point getting Keenly Empowered as you already get that from your secondary. I would even go as far as to say you shouldn't even bother using any named bows. A simple purple bow with Attunement and Jagged would outdamage any named bow out there. Regardless, that leaves a third perk slot, Enchanted or Vicious. I prefer Vicious because it works on skills, headshots, back attacks, and random body crits, which are boosted by your Keen Awareness ring I mentioned earlier, and the way the crit formula works. So in a sense, it completely just outclasses Enchanted and is more of a universal damage boost. Also, not to mention it's better for this build as it gives you a better chance at one-comboing people with my Javelin combo. The argument here is that your skill burst matters way more to kill someone than your left clicks. Watch almost any of my clips and you see the main way I end up killing someone is with consecutive skills hitting them, which don't get boosted by Enchanted at all. So this section is for an offhand Rapier bow build. Icicle is just a perfect kiting and 1vx Rapier in my opinion, which is pretty much all I use my Rapier for. It has Keenly Empowered, an amazing skill perk, and Refreshing Evasion, all you really need. And then all you do is replace one of your freedom pieces with Sundering Riposte instead. Lastly, we have gems. I really see zero point using split physical and elemental gems because the only element that actually hurts is Fire Staff, which is the counter to bows. So you might as well go full Onyx to survive all the other bows and muskets shooting you along with melee weapons because you constantly go in melee range as a spear. Then just run 1 or 2 fire gems and maybe even use cheap gemstone dust for when you fight a good mage, which is rare nowadays. Best of both worlds. And that pretty much sums up the guide. Any question you guys have, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll put my Discord in the description if you want to contact me privately as well. Highly recommend you to sub if you want to see gameplay like this on an almost daily basis.